Thank you, Mark. Excellent start to this afternoon's session. Our next speaker is Jenna Ross, who we heard from just before lunch. She introduced herself, but she forgot to say at that time that she's worked globally in the United States and in Africa, long periods in Africa. She described herself before lunch as an enthusiast for slugs. She must have some sympathy for them at the moment because we haven't yet put any seed in the ground to feed them this autumn. Jenna, over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, Your Highness, Lords, ladies and gentlemen. As David mentioned in my introduction, I spent several years working across sub-Saharan Africa. And it was during this time I came across, I happened to be back in the UK, and I came across the following headline. 500 billion slugs set to invade Britain after springtime sex frenzy swells the population by 20%. Now, there's two things that's shocking about this. First of all, that the Sun could combine sex frenzy, slimy lust, and slugs in the same headline. And second of all, after all these years living overseas, I realized that nothing had really moved forward when it came to slug control in the UK. And that was really the birth of my Nuffield Farming Scholarship. So I set myself 6 objectives. First of all, to characterize the key slug species that we actually have in the UK right now, to identify potential invasions and their impact on biosecurity, to determine the direct and indirect economic risk of slugs, to review slug monitoring systems and evaluate slug control options, to investigate novel commercial opportunities for actually utilizing slugs, and finally to look at the future of malacology, which is the study of slugs and snails. So I spent 26 weeks last year traveling the world, meeting researchers, scientists, agronomists, farmers, industry experts, really getting to grips with where we are right now with slug control. And that was gathering a mixture of qualitative and quantitative data that I then brought back to formulate into my report, which I published last month. And what I've tried to do in this presentation is summarize a 100-page report into 4 key conclusions. So key conclusion number 1. Over 50% of slug species are actually exotic in the UK, which is really high, and they have a both direct and indirect economic impact. So what do I mean by direct economic impact? I'm speaking about crop damage. Here we have an example of the grey field slug, Ross reticulatum, completely annihilating a corn crop in Canada. Next, on the left-hand side, we can see damage to beans in Brazil. And on the right, does anyone know what that person's holding in their hand? Truffle, yeah, it's truffle. So what we discovered is that slugs have very expensive taste. So that small hole in that truffle has devalued it significantly because it's such a high value crop. When we were in Kenya, we discovered that local indigenous slugs love kale. And pretty much the final conclusion is that slugs are generalist feeders. They'll pretty much eat everything and anything. And they can be so damaging that they can completely wipe out a field. And this is an example of a canola crop in the Western Cape Province in South Africa. So as well as having a direct economic impact, they can also have a non-direct economic impact. And that can be through contamination of exported crops, which they can get rejected. It can be through the impact on soil health, through slug control strategies such as ploughing, or in Australia where burning is still heavily relied on. And it can also have an indirect impact on human and animal health. An example of this is the rat lungworm. So in Hawaii, over the last 10 years, the rat lungworm has become extremely prevalent, thanks to this semi-slug here, the Parmeria mertensi. It's carrying such a high number, and what happens is it goes from the rat to the slug as the intermediate host into the human, and it can lead to non-recoverable meningitis. And there's been 82 cases in the last 10 years alone, and we're now seeing a very similar result happening in Costa Rica. Key conclusion number 2. Farmers should consider a slug-integrated pest management strategy pyramid that should be tailor-made to each field. So what do I mean by that? I mean that we need to look at, first of all, the agronomic practices and cultural control methods we're using. We need to look at monitoring, threshold levels, record keeping, and forecasting 1, 2, 3 years in advance. We need to look at physical barriers, so how we physically keep slugs out of the field. We need to think about biological control, so the use of one living organism to control another living organism, such as the Indian runner ducks mentioned earlier, or parasitic nematodes, which is my speciality. Biorational control, so biologically derived compounds, so thinking plant extracts, so spearmint oil, clove bud oil. And finally, you have chemical control at the top of that pyramid. So here we're thinking about metaldehyde and ferric phosphate. And we're really going from prevention right down at the bottom there, up to the top of the pyramid, which is intervention. Key conclusion number 3. The study of malacology appears to be in difficulty, with no clear succession plan in place and limited opportunities to share and develop ideas. Now, until this year, the last Slug and Snail Global Conference was back in 2013. That meant experts in my area have spent the last 6 years without the opportunity to share and develop ideas. And I'm going to come back to that key conclusion in a second. And finally, should we flip the problem on its head? And should we farm slugs instead? And where does this come from? Well, when I was in Japan, I went to visit one of the very few live snail facial clinics in the world. And the idea is you get your live snails put on your face, and that delivers your snail slime directly to your skin, so you're getting delivery of antioxidants, collagen, all your anti-wrinkle properties. And people pay $175 for this treatment, with a recommendation of 6 treatments. So it's big money to be made. And while I was there, I thought, well, if you can do that with snails, and snails have a shell, so in theory, when a snail has been attacked, it can retract into its shell for protection. Slugs don't have that. So if they're injured, they have to work extra hard to recover themselves. So it means, in theory, they produce higher concentrations of antioxidants and higher concentrations of collagen, which means they would be better candidates for cosmetics. The second opportunity I'm suggesting is in pharmaceuticals. So this lady with me is a lady called Ana Rita, and this is in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And Anna's managed to extract molecules from slug slime from South America, and she's discovered that they have antiviral properties. And she's been, first of all, working on the measles virus, and then on the herpes virus, and now she's working on an extremely exciting tropical virus that could have a massive impact. So key recommendations for my conclusions. Key recommendation number 1, implementation of biosecurity protocols to prevent future invasions of exotic slugs and employ an eradication protocol for those who have already established. So I worked closely with the USDA while I was traveling to come up with a list of recommendations for a potential biosecurity protocol, and we've summed up these into 6 key points. We need to identify the active malacologists in the UK. We need to develop a centralized system for inspections. We need to develop a legal framework that allows us to hold commodities. We need a system for identification, so that's digital imaging, molecular analysis. We need to develop a system that allows us to hold action and control. And finally, we need collaboration, and that's collaboration not just between government departments, but between government to government internationally. And what about the slug species that we already have? Well, this guy here is the famous Spanish slug, Arion vulgaris. And you can see from the map on the right-hand side that he's pretty widespread, from southern point in England right up to Wick up there in Scotland. And you might think, well, if it's so widespread, can we actually do anything about it? And I think, yes, we can. And the USDA offered up a fantastic case study for this. They have been able to completely eradicate the giant African snail in the state of Florida, which is an extremely important state for them from a production point of view. And they've done that using really innovative methods. And 2 of those that have really stuck with me is, 1, they set up a children's snail detective program so that kids, if they found a snail, they could work towards their snail detective badge, their sheriff's badge. And then they then report that to their teachers. And second of all, they train specially trained sniffer dogs to identify the snail. And I think we can do exactly the same with the Spanish slug. Key recommendation number 2, we need investment into the key parts of integrated pest management strategy. Now, first of all, we need to look at monitoring. Right now, we're still really relying on actually getting out there and physically counting slugs. And a lot of farmers aren't partaking in this key practice, and that has led to where we are right now when it comes to metaldehyde. And I think there's opportunities to implement technology into this, to look at real-time monitoring, to look at robotics in the system. And second of all, we need investment into new products, whether that's biological, biorational, physical barriers, chemicals. We need to look at getting these quicker to market, so obviously looking at the registration process and getting products to the hands of the farmers. Key recommendation number 3, promote malacology to the next generation, secure investment for conferences to share and develop ideas, and encourage citizen science programs. Well, during my Nuffield travels, I had the absolute pleasure of re-establishing that Slug and Snail conference. And this year in July, we were all met in Spain, so I brought together malacologists from around the world where we could share our research and also develop new ideas for projects, which is really important in my current job. And it was such a successful conference that we're already planning our next conference. Another key output of my Nuffield project has been the establishment of 2 citizen science projects, one in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and another one in Nairobi in Kenya. And that's been working with local scientists, local students, local communities, getting them engaged with what slug species they have, what crops these slugs are damaging, and what control options they have. And it was such a pleasure last week to be back in Kenya and see that project still active and producing some really high quality, high publishable results. And finally, we need to invest and promote opportunities for farming slugs for the food, cosmetic and pharmaceutical industries. Because, ladies and gentlemen, is the problem actually the solution? Finally, I just want to finish by thanking the AHDB Cereals and Oilseeds and also the Royal Highland and Agricultural Society for choosing me as a 2018 Nuffield Scholar. And I also want to thank my additional top-up sponsors, because without their additional money, I wouldn't have been able to achieve such ambitious objectives. And finally, thanks to each and every person that contributed to my project, because without everybody's input, I wouldn't have been able to produce such an in-depth report. And also thanks to the contribution from the editing team, Christine Hill, and also my mentor, Jan Redpath. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.